What is a Woman? A movie that should be reviewed more, for one thing. Matt Walsh pranks the pants off America's silliest intellectuals, and the sad thing is, it wasn't hard at all. Several months ago, I interviewed a feminist writer named Kara Dansky as part of the Meet the Censored series. The piece was written and edited, but I kept putting off publication, telling myself each week the time wasn't right. In truth, I was afraid of dealing with blowback from trans activists. It was the first time I was scared away from a topic. I apologized to Kara this week and am running the interview concurrent with this review. The point being, if even a serial gobbler of negative attention like me is nervous about publishing someone else's opinions on a subject, remember, just co-signing the infamous Harper's letter with J.K. Rowling ended up costing Substack's Matt Iglesias a spot at a company he co-founded, Vox. That means no one with even a theoretical link to left liberal audiences will want to go near this topic voluntarily. Which brings us to Matt Walsh's new movie, What is a Woman? Simultaneously the most talked about and most ignored documentary in the world. The movie, which tries and fails to get trans activists, academics, and medical professionals to offer a definition of womanhood, is both trending and more or less totally unreviewed. The most prominent outlets who have admitted to watching it have names like The Christian Post and Spectator Australia, despite a 96% audience rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The film is narrated by Walsh and distributed by Ben Shapiro's conservative Daily Wire, which is crucial to understanding why it will be a success even if, especially if, no mainstream reviewers touch it. The controversy in the film could have been explored to great effect by someone on the other side, but since the topic mostly just terrifies people over there, the entire debate has become the property of conservatives like Walsh and Christopher Rufo by default. There's a small community on the left of people like Dansky that's been trying to elevate various concerns for years, without much success. More on them in a moment. The plot is simple. Walsh, a religious conservative provocateur who's written books with titles like Church of Cowards, a wake-up call to complacent Christians, and The Unholy Trinity, blocking the left's assault on life, marriage, and gender, travels to women's marches, visits with women's studies professors, interviews doctors who perform vaginoplasty surgeries, and asks all, what is a woman? The operative joke is none of these self-proclaimed experts on womanhood can or will answer the question. Years ago, when I first started publishing The Exile in Russia, almost every prank we tried worked, even the dumb ones, because officials in Soviet society had been raised in complete insulation from the practical joke and therefore bit on every hook. The specialists in Walsh's film are the same types of targets. Most are used to having their bullshit rubber stamped and don't realize they're playing themselves. Walsh is a ham and a satirist, a creature we never used to see on the political right decades ago. The verbose absurdity of modern leftist thought, coupled with the astonishing absence of a sense of humor in the landscapes from whence the most extreme ideas come, has willed conservative comedy into being. Walsh makes easy work of these pre-offended subjects. He's got people taking seriously his capsule Twitter self-description as a theocratic fascist, and a children's book project, Johnny the Walrus, was the joke equivalent of walking through a wide-open door and picking up an unguarded bag of money. The illustrated book tells of little Johnny, who variously dreams of being a dinosaur and a knight, and then a walrus. He puts wooden spoons in his mouth as tusks, only to have adults seize on the latter fantasy and embrace it to the point where he ends up stuck a walrus forever. He can't change his mind, because human walruses are real walruses. You can almost hear activists grumbling, very funny, motherfucker, except the book with a few tweaks would read exactly like leaden, activist-approved children's allegories like Jack, not Jackie. This is probably why Johnny the Walrus more or less immediately hit #1 on Amazon's LGBTQ+ list. Amazon, humorously, put them in the category on their own. That was before the online retailer panicked and after an uproar recategorized Walrus as political and social commentary, with Target pulling the book altogether. Meanwhile, audiences without much of a dog in the fight were left to wonder why Jack, not Jackie, a book written and published in partnership with the adult political organization GLAAD, is not political and social commentary, but Walsh's leg-pulling, accidental bestseller is. As with Walrus, What is a Woman? Lets targets mock themselves. Two scenes sum up the movie. In one, white-haired Don Zucker, owner of Zucker & Sons Star Wars shop in Aberdeen, Washington, explains an incident from last August when he put a sign in his store that read, Dr. Seuss has a new book out. If you are born with a dick, you are not a chick. Why did Zucker put that sign up? In my admittedly limited experience, there are three types of people who come out as detractors to current trans thinking. Some disagree on scientific grounds, like biologist Colin Wright. Others, like Dansky and Rowling, have feminist critiques. A third group, I think, just gets weirded out seeing people in dresses, heels, and beards, and objects to the entire phenomenon. I leave it to the reader to guess where Sucre falls on the spectrum, but if you put a sign in your store that essentially reads, "Fuck your beliefs," it won't be long in the internet age before someone takes the cheese. Sure enough, trans councilwoman Tiesa Meskis showed up at Sucre's store, and the two had a fierce argument that went viral, with Sucre complaining, "I went to Vietnam to fight for all this shit." At the end of his interview with Sucre, Walsh asked the central question. "You're not a scientist, you're not a gender studies major," Walsh says. "How do you know that you're a man?" "I guess," Sucre shrugs, "because I got a dick." Conversely, in another scene, Walsh interviews a Tennessee licensed marital and family therapist named Gert Comfrey. Walsh reads from her website. "You say, I use a combination of approaches in my therapeutic work, including anti-oppression, feminist, and narrative frameworks. I rely deeply on systems theory and the understanding that individuals are products of and in dialogue with our surroundings, including our families, broader culture, workplaces, nature, and political climates. What, does that mean?" Comfrey, who's game and a good sport, tries to translate. "Yeah, so, thinking about the modalities that I use, I'm definitely informed by, feminist family therapy, and the ideas that we live in gendered worlds where there are certain imperatives that are placed on us about who we are and what we do based on how we've been gendered." Comfrey goes on like this for 2.5 agonizing minutes, during which time they, preferred pronouns are they, them, theirs, I checked, say things like, "We know now that some women have penises, right? Some men have vaginas." Walsh prods, saying he likes scented candles and has watched Sex and the City. How does he know he's not a woman? And if his mother's a woman, and his wife is a woman, and the boy who sits down and says, "I think I'm a girl," is a woman, what is a woman? "Great question," Comfrey replies with a nod, before dismounting to the surprise ending. "I'm not a woman, so I can't really answer that." What matters about these two scenes? The store owner Sucre, who admits to being old and set in his ways, and may really be transphobic in the actual sense of the term, is nonetheless able to answer the film's key question in simple language. To reach that person, to change that person's mind, someone has to come up with a way to reach him in equally plain language. But the most well-meaning intellectual in the movie, Comfrey, by far the most sympathetic trans advocate Walsh interviews, has a website composed in an Amazonian jungle thicket of anti-language that even I have a hard time penetrating, and not only can't answer Walsh's simple question, but ultimately declines to do so on the grounds that even a person born female, or assigned female at birth if you like Comfrey, is not qualified to answer it. The civil rights movement was won in courts, but also by simple force of argument. We are all human beings, and loving one another, as Martin Luther King put it, is our basic Christian command. That simple message moved people over time. The gay rights movement similarly earned wide acceptance in part because the public believed research about the immutability of orientation, and took in the work of people like psychologist Evelyn Hooker, which showed gay people were not suffering from a pathology, and therefore not afflicted with a disorder that needed curing. Minds were opened by these simple truths. The message of What is a Woman is not only are there no simple answers to the questions and reservations felt by millions of ordinary people about gender affirmation, including huge numbers of Democrats, as polls in places like Florida show. But the movie shows academic after academic and activist after activist seething at the mere implication that they should have to explain themselves. Their attitude is positively medieval. We keep the Bible in Latin for a reason. They invent new nomenclature almost daily, making a priesthood of interpreting academics central to the new religion. The problem is, to the uninformed, all the simple truths seem to run in the other direction. Like that it sure doesn't look like fair competition when swimmer Leah Thomas massacres pools full of assigned-at-birth girls. If you've been on Twitter, you've seen it. But in the movie, there's a real interview with a real professor who goes ape when Walsh invokes the word truth, which sounds transphobic to Herr Professor. It's as if these interview subjects believe winning over people who don't already agree with them is not only not important, but offensive and beneath them. Certainly the subjects in What is a Woman go out of their way to dismiss as utterly insignificant those who don't share their worldview. When Walsh interviews gynecologist Dr. Macy Bowers, he begins by asking, the critics on the other side of the issue. He has to pause because Bowers recoils in exaggerated fashion, shaking her head like a person waked by revolting smelling salts. There aren't many, she scoffs, but go ahead. There aren't many who would disagree with what you're saying? Well, the dinosaurs of the world are certainly out there. Meanwhile, Walsh, whom I followed a little, and with whom I often violently disagree on all sorts of issues, including this one. He, for instance, tweeted that it should be illegal for any doctor to do transition surgery at any age, made a conscious decision in What is a Woman to aim the movie at people with differing views. We definitely wanted to present the story in a way that would reach as wide an audience as possible without compromising the central message of the film, he told me. We want this to get outside of the conservative podcast audience bubble. I think so far it has. On the other hand, the center-left media world has been so brutal to people from their own ranks who've tried to raise questions about what, by any estimation, is an incredibly difficult subject, that nothing like such a film could ever be made on that side. The Daily Wire is perhaps one of the few places able to make a documentary like this today, is how biologist Colin Wright puts it. I'm thinking not just of Dansky, but of people like Katie Herzog, a lesbian writer-podcaster who's been ostracized ever since writing an empathetic piece on detransitioners in The Stranger 5 years ago called They Were Transgender Until They Weren't. Herzog hosts a successful podcast called Blocked and Reported with Single, but is regularly denounced as a transphobe in papers like The Washington Post, while her broadcast partner seems to have had more articles written about his supposed transphobia than all the world's actual transphobes combined. Single has an entire page of sins outlining GLAAD's accountability project, where he was granted a place in the unofficial blacklist next to the likes of Donald Trump, Franklin Graham, and Kid Rock. When I asked people like Herzog, Dansky, Single, and a handful of other media figures who've gotten in the soup over this issue about Walsh's movie, there was positivity, with caveats. On the plus side, a common observation was the movie was skillfully done. Walsh's opening sequences would show him looking stone-faced and miserable as he recites platitudes about the joys of parenting, or taking a pensive man walk with a fishing pole into an idyllic Bob Ross-like pond landscape before admitting he sucks at fishing. Got good reviews. As one writer commented, it sent a signal from the start that he took himself less seriously than the people he interviewed. On the negative side, there were a few comments about a scene in which Walsh showed his wife asking him to help open a jar being representative of his views on women. More importantly, there was frustration that a lot of people, women especially, who have taken a lot of heat over the years for speaking up, have had to sit back and watch people like Walsh and Chris Rufo take credit for pushing these issues into the mainstream. A number of people also suggested that a documentary produced by the Daily Wire, even if well done, automatically had no chance of changing the minds of mainstream Democrats. See Dansky's interview for a version of this argument. But overall, I'd say these figures rated the movie a net plus. Some, whether prompted or unprompted, took issue with some Walsh views not presented in the movie. When I asked Herzog about the idea that transition should always be illegal, she said, "Hard disagree. I think for adults there's a basic question of autonomy. And though the research is weaker than people admit, there's some evidence the treatments help," she said. For kids, the research is way shakier and the assessment process should be very intense. As to the movie itself, I thought the movie was pretty well done, but he definitely ignored the many, many feminists who've been fighting this. Wright said, "I think he did a great job highlighting just how radical gender ideology is. It is not simply pseudoscience, but is anti-science as it fundamentally rejects the notion of a stable and discoverable material reality." He added, "Gender ideology views truth as something that is literally socially constructed by language, and therefore rejects the notion of the truth in favor of relativistic notions of your truth and my truth." The latter point gets back to what I think is an emerging political problem for Democrats in general, who ahead of crucial midterm elections continue to lose ground on an educational issue that A, is crucial to House races, and B, they've traditionally dominated. Polls show they're dropping from a historical 20, 30, even 40-point lead to the statistical margin of error this spring, in part because of this issue. There is a perception that these relatively new controversies have been declared undebatable by a priesthood of experts who feel above talking to the unwashed. The reaction to Walsh's movie on the Twitter sphere has been predictable, with lots of denunciations of the bearded filmmaker as a fascist bigot, but relatively few efforts to answer the film's question, which humorously would end the entire controversy. My favorite response to date was an angry suggestion by Blue Chuck Substacker Ben Dreyfus. "Are you saying eunuchs shouldn't be allowed to castrate themselves?" I mean, I guess they should be, but most eunuchs in history had someone do it for them, and those stories aren't exactly happy ones, for anyone but certain very fanatic music lovers. But I digress. It'll be easy enough for mainstream critics to ignore this film, and they will. In a democracy, though, at some point you have to answer the population's questions in a way that makes sense to them. Otherwise, they will flock to the first person who does offer a comprehensible answer. I saw this with the financial crisis, where candidates like Hillary Clinton tried incomprehensibly to blame 2008 on shadow banking offenders who, by an extraordinary coincidence, didn't overlap with any of the roughly 10 million financial institutions who paid her millions in speaking fees. The public had dealt with banks firsthand and didn't buy it, believing Donald Trump more when he pointed the finger at firms like Goldman Sachs. Ignoring popular discontent or confusion on principle isn't a strategy that can ever work for any political movement. Walsh's movie exposes this, and give him credit. He got the people inclined to hate him the most to make his arguments for him. Thanks for listening to the audio version of this article. For more, visit taibbi.substack.com.